Hey there. Today I will be reading for you a no-sleep story called Fran and Jock. It was written by Reddit user pippinacious. Okay, here we go. I was the last in a long line of grandkids on both sides of the family. No one has ever said as much, but I'm pretty sure I was an oops baby, the result of one too many glasses of wine and a couple over 40 who thought unplanned pregnancies were for teenagers. Oops. By the time I came along, both of my grandmothers already passed away, and my grandfathers were elderly and lived in different states. Trying to coordinate travel plans for a family of 5, including an infant, was difficult on a budget, and neither of my grandpas were up for frequent trips, so visits were rare and spaced out over long periods. Still, both of my parents wanted me to have a relationship with them, so we trade phone calls so they could hear my nonsensical baby babble. They'd also write letters for Mom and Dad to read to me, and they'd get crayon scribbles in return. When I was 3, they both started to experience declines in health. First my maternal grandpa, then my paternal one. Fearing the worst, Mom purchased a pair of teddy bears, the kind that had recorders in them so you could record a message that would play when the bear was hugged, and made sure to get a message saved from both. My mom's father died when I was 4. A few days after his funeral, I was given a white teddy bear with bright blue eyes that twinkled from beneath a plaid flat cap and a green sweater. When I gave it a squeeze, I heard my grandpa's slightly muffled voice from its stomach. "I love you, Sadie." 2 years later, after Dad's father passed, I got the other one. It was a slate gray color, and the stitching on his face gave him a rather serious expression for a stuffed animal. A pair of red suspenders held up tan trousers. I fell asleep hugging it, and my dad told me some years later, with tears in his eyes, that randomly throughout the night he kept hearing Grandpa's voice coming from my room. "I love you, Sadie." I named my white bear Fran and my gray bear Jock, and put them on a shelf above my bed, where they sat throughout my entire childhood. Honestly, I didn't give them much thought. They had become fixtures of the room, the same way the lamp and the dresser were. Every now and again, I'd come home from school to find one of my parents standing beside my bed, looking up at the bears, or giving them a little squeeze. Even as time passed, they still recited their single phrase without fail. Aside from those instances, though, Fran and Jock were little more than dust collectors from my childhood. When I went away to college, the two didn't make the cut, and were left behind while I made my way out into the world for the first time. I think my parents were a little bit disappointed that I wasn't more sentimental over the teddy bears, but any memories I had of my grandpas were hazy at best, and I didn't have the same emotional connection that they did. When Mom gently asked about whether I would like them moved into my first apartment, I told her no. They were better off with her. "Okay," she said. "Well, they'll be here if you change your mind." I was pretty confident I wouldn't. The next time I went back to my parents' place was to house sit while Dad and Mom on their long-awaited vacation out west. He'd been promising her they'd go for over 30 years, and they were both buzzing with excitement. In typical Mom fashion, however, she was also very nervous. "You remember where all the financial documents are in case anything happens to us, right?" she asked from the back seat at least 6 times on the drive to the airport. "Yes, in the white bin under your bed," And the wills? Fireproof lockbox on the back of your closet. And I think she's got it, hon, Dad said, reaching back to give her knee a squeeze. Mom grunted and sat back. Just call if you need anything. I'll be fine. Don't worry. You're only going for 1 week. A lot can happen in a week, she said. I grinned at her in the rearview mirror, unconcerned, and she made a face at me, but seemed to relax a little bit. After I dropped them off, I drove back to their place and started to make myself at home again. I tossed my suitcase on the bed, and I went to the kitchen to make some dinner and catch up on one of my shows. It had been a while since I had a true, completely free week off all on myself, and I planned to take full advantage of it. After I ate, I kicked my feet up, stretched out, and commenced lazy lump mode. I managed to get almost 3 episodes of my television show in before I started to nod off. I checked the clock over the TV inside. It was only just after 11. I was really turning into an old, early-to-bed woman already. The horror. I rolled off the couch and shut the TV and all the lights, plunging the house into deep darkness. Even in the inky black, I didn't feel the twinge of nervousness. I'd grown up in this house after all, and I knew it like the back of my hand. All of its creaks and groans were almost comforting. I made my way to my room and flipped on the light. It had been at least 5 years since I lived there. But my parents hadn't done very much to change the room, except store a few bits and bobs in the closet. They said it was so I'd know I'd always had a place to come if I needed to come back home. I thought it was because changing would make the fact that I was out for good more real to them. Whatever the reason, I appreciated the familiarity. As I started to unpack my bag, my eye was drawn to the shelf over my bed. Fran and Jock, ever vigilant, were standing in the same spots they've occupied for most of my life. I don't know why, but I couldn't help but smile and reach out to them. I took Fran down first and gave his little cap a tweak before squeezing him around the stomach. "I love you, Sadie," Grandpa said. After putting Fran back, I did the same to Jacques, who stared up at me with his usual sternness even as I plucked one of the red suspenders. "I love you, Sadie," Grandpa said. It was the first time I'd listened to them in a while. Even if they didn't resonate as deeply with me as they did my parents, I was glad to find the recording still worked. A quick trip to the bathroom and a change into my pajamas later, I was falling fast asleep in bed. I can't say exactly what woke me. A nightmare, I figured, given that my heart was beating quite quickly, but I couldn't remember any of the details. I took a deep breath and rolled over, already falling half asleep again, and found myself face to face with the dark figure on the pillow beside me. I yelped and sat up, grabbing my phone, the nearest source of light, and shined it towards my bed. Fran was lying on his side beside me. I let out a small chuckle and gave myself a little shake to dismiss the lingering fright that he'd caused, and picked him up. "Did you fall off the shelf?" I asked him quietly. I must have put him back too close to the edge earlier, and gravity had done its job. I gave Fran a squeeze. "Get out." I stared down at the bear and blinked once, very slowly. I must be more sleepy than I realized, I thought. I was hearing things. To prove to myself it had just been my imagination, I squeezed him again. "Get out." It was still Grandpa's voice, but instead of the soft warmth it always had, it sounded cold, almost menacing. I threw Fran across the room where it hit the wall. From over my head, I heard Grandpa's voice more loudly. "Get out." I whipped around and looked up at Jacques. He was sitting in the same place he always had, but now he was turned towards the door instead of facing forwards. Had I really put him down like that? I couldn't remember. "Get out," Grandpa's voice came from Fran again, even louder this time. "Get out," Grandpa echoed from Jacques. The two went back and forth, their voices getting louder and louder, until I slapped my hands over my ears and leapt from the bed. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck behind my fear-tangled tongue. I stumbled across my dark room, chased by my long-dead grandfather's voices. "I know you're down there," Jacques shouted with Grandpa's voice. I froze. "Down there? Down under the shelf?" I glanced over my shoulder at the gray bear sitting silently down from over my bed. I had to get out of my room. I had to get out of the house. I yanked my door open. "I see you," Fran said in Grandpa's voice. I was halfway out into the hall, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what was happening. Was I going crazy? Was I dreaming? All I knew was that my two childhood toys were screaming threats at me, and I had to get the hell away from them. I turned to the stairs. "You take one more step and I'll make sure it's your last," Jacques bellowed. "Get out," Fran roared. From somewhere downstairs, a step creaked. Someone else was in the house. They weren't yelling at me, I realized, with a very strange mix of confusion and relief, and a newly formed horror. They were yelling at the intruder who was making their way upstairs, towards me. "Get out," my grandfathers howled together. Footsteps clambered across the wood floor downstairs. Something fell over in the living room with a loud crash, and then again in the kitchen, before the back door slammed against the counter as it was thrown open and a car engine rumbled to life. Somehow I regained my wits enough to run to my parents' room and look out the window to see the driveway below. An SUV was peeling backwards into the street. It slammed into the neighbor's mailbox, righted itself, and screeched off into the night. A heavy quiet had fallen over the house again. After waiting a few long, tense minutes, I crept back across the hall and peeked into my room. Fran and Jacques were where I'd left them, both completely silent. When they stayed that way, I hesitantly approached Fran, who was lying on his side with his little cap flat beside him. I picked him up, and with trembling fingers, I squeezed the stomach. "I love you, Sadie," Grandpa said warmly. I put his cap back on his head and gently put him back on the shelf beside Jacques and backed out of the room, watching them the whole time with my eyes wide. As I rounded the corner, heading downstairs to the phone, I heard Grandpa's voice trailing after me. "I love you, Sadie." The police arrived a bit later, following my frantic call to 911. I filed a report, leaving out the bit about the talking bears, and allowed them to collect whatever evidence they could. Every so often, I found myself glancing at the stairs, almost like I was expecting a repeat of whatever happened. It never came, and the cops wrapped it up, leaving me alone once again. When I called my parents to tell them about the break-in, they immediately wanted to rush home, but I assured them there was no need. "Really?" I said. "I don't think I have anything to worry about." "We could be on the next plane," Mom insisted. No, I'm okay. Whoever that guy was, I'm pretty sure he won't be coming back." It took a few more go-arounds, but I eventually convinced them that I was safe. And I felt it, too, for the most part at least. After the initial shock had worn off, and I'd had time to process what happened, I really was okay. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't tell anyone what had happened without sounding crazy, but I knew it had been real, and I knew as long as I had Fran and Jock sitting on the shelf above my bed, I could sleep easily. A few days later, the cops did find the guy who broke in. He was a co-worker of my dad's who'd overheard that he'd be out of town. He thought the house would be empty and easy pickings. When he tried to tell them about the two crazy guys upstairs and their violent threats, they rolled their eyes and laughed at him. He was very surprised to hear that only a 22-year-old woman had been in the house during his botched burglary. When I returned home to my apartment a week later, Fran and Jacques were with me. I keep them on the TV stand in the living room now, where they have a full view of the front door. Whenever I start to feel a bit anxious about being alone, I'll give each bear a little squeeze and a smile as they speak. "I love you, Sadie." But now, I respond, "I love you both too."